All right, folks, here we go with the notes for Chapter 18. We're going to talk about the measurements that we use for advertising in this chapter. Over 80% of digital advertising is bought and sold programmatically, and programmatic buying allows advertisers to target and buy specific individual consumer impressions instead of buying broad audiences. So, as we are moving more and more into new media and using computers to help us to determine audiences and determine metrics and things like this, we can get a more precise overview of how effective our advertising is being. The need for measuring mass audiences has diminished, and because of that, things like television and radio are having to find new methods for targeting lifestyle and psychographics, purchase likely audience segments, all this sort of stuff, because, well, those that are advertising are demanding that they have that sort of information. So they're having to look at how to be able to be a lot more accurate and more specific in the ways that they are measuring their audiences and their effectiveness. Now, the job of media salespeople as a result of this, you have to get results for your customers. I mean, that's always been the case. But in order to achieve that objective, you need to understand how digital advertising is measured. This chapter is going to talk a lot about some of the terminology and some of the metrics by which we use that terminology. Target audience. Target audience is the most important marketing decision an advertiser will make because it drives all subsequent decisions and many of the decisions you make as a media salesperson about how to help a customer get results. Makes sense. We talk about this all the time. The two main questions any communicator needs to be able to answer. What is your message? Who is your audience? But now, answering the question of who the audience is isn't always obvious. If you haven't taken a chance to look at the textbook, read page 376. There's the example in there about selling carpet and the different demographics that you have to reach in terms of selling carpet. Different points in the process is going to appeal to different demographics, and reaching out to them is going to require different thoughts and different methodology. So take a look at that. And perhaps we can, when we get together for class, maybe think about other types of advertising, different products and services, and maybe what other audiences there are for those products and services besides the one that we may think is obvious. Now, universal estimate, or UE. This is the number of people within a broadcast media coverage area. In other words, this is basically the general population, everyone involved within a certain geometry. This is the number that we use to calculate ratings. Now let's talk about that geography a little bit. For national television, it makes sense that we would be talking about the entire country, especially when we're talking about measurements for broadcast networks, cable, syndication, that sort of thing. We're looking at the whole of the United States. For local radio, it's going to be the counties that are covered by a station's signal, and that's usually going to be defined in terms of the SMSA, or the Standard Metropolitan Statistical Area. There's going to be certain counties that are blocked off to say that this is basically the approximate signal strength and the geographical reach of the signal of a particular radio station. In television, it's called the DMA, the Designated Market Area. These are usually bigger than the reaches of radio stations in terms of distance and coverage. So for local television, they use the DMA in order to determine the geographic coverage for the TV station. For digital content, the coverage can be geographically as precise or as broad as desired through the use of geo-targeting. This is the practice of targeting users based on their geographic location, and many times also excluding people based on their geographic location. This can get as detailed as looking up people by zip code, and sometimes even segments within a zip code, looking at certain neighborhoods or certain quadrants of town. That perhaps there's a reason to market to the south side as opposed to the north side, or the east side as opposed to the west side. You get the idea. Now, an advertising impression is a single exposure of a message to one person in a target audience. Now, an impression doesn't necessarily mean that a consumer actually paid attention to an ad or interacted with an ad. It just means they were in the same space at the same time. The concept of gross impressions begins with the total number of people viewing a banner or a text or an ad or whatever the ad is, whatever the content is. But the concept of gross impressions is more than that. It's the simple addition of the impressions every time an ad is displayed. Every single time. It does not account for duplication. So, say for example, you're watching a television show. It's an hour-long show. And during the course of that television show, you saw a particular advertisement, and that advertisement ran 3 times within the course of that show. That means it made 3 gross impressions on you. For simple math, let's say 99 other people watched the show with you, total of 100 people. That means that ad had a gross impression rate of 300. Again, it does not account for whether people actually interacted with the ad. It does not account for the fact that one person is seeing the ad 3 times. It doesn't make those mathematical equations. It's just saying it made 300 gross impressions. It doesn't necessarily say those gross impressions were only for 100 people. It's much more meaningful to think of the impressions as the percent of the target audience universe. This percentage is called a rating. So if you have 1% of the population of an area that is exposed to content, the rating is 1. Makes sense. Advertisers add the ratings of all the programs where advertising appears to get GRPs, gross rating points. They're typically used to describe the message weight for a certain period of time, whether it's a week or a month. Those are the general spans that you're going to look at. Sometimes they'll even do it by the flight of an ad campaign if they want to look at measurement as a whole. And now, again, GRPs do not account for duplication. So you've got all of these gross values, but it could be based on one person having seen something several times. Let's talk about reach versus frequency. Reach is the percent of a target audience that is exposed to an ad at least once. There's different terms for this out there. CUM is one that's pretty popular. CUM, short for cumulative audience. And this would be the number of unique persons that is being exposed to something. It's also called unduplicated audience in some circles. It's also called net reach. They all mean the same thing. It means that there's a certain number of unique people that have been exposed to something. Meanwhile, frequency is going to be the average number of times that a person that was reached would see an ad. So in our earlier example, when you were exposed to an ad 3 times over the course of watching a television program, your frequency would be 3 for you. Now, in order to get gross ratings points, you're going to multiply the reach and the frequency, and that's how you get that value. Now, advertisers and their agencies are generally going to use CPM, or cost per thousand, as the measure of media efficiency. Why is it called CPM? Well, M is the Roman numeral for 1,000. So CPM, cost per thousand. It's calculated by dividing the cost of the ad by thousands of impressions. So really what we're saying here is we're answering the question, how much money does it cost to reach 1,000 people? So it gives a little bit of an apples to apples sort of way to kind of think about how much you're paying for an ad and what its effective reach is going to be. Meanwhile, CPP is cost per point or cost per rating point. It's going to answer the question, how much does it cost to reach 1% of the population? That might be a more valuable number to some people. especially if you're trying to measure the effectiveness within a certain medium. So take television, for example. If you know that you've got a certain audience that watches a particular television show and you want to reach that particular audience, the cost per point is going to help you to be able to see how much it costs to reach a certain percentage of that particular audience for that particular content. And that might be something that is more valuable in terms of thinking about your message and your audience and the delivery of that message in the particular medium that you're in. Now, a total ad buy in digital is often going to be looked at in terms of tens of millions of impressions scattered over dozens of websites or apps. So really what we're looking here is to try to determine how much engagement an ad impression is going to get. That's where we're really going to see the success of an ad campaign. And we're going to get into more detail on that when we go into the second half of the chapter, and we'll do that over in the next video.